I sat at my kitchen table 2 years ago with my Social Security statement in one hand and my grocery receipt in the other, doing math I already knew the answer to, understanding that $1,900 a month simply wasn't going to keep working as a number I could survive on. I remember the specific moment that math stopped being abstract, staring at a receipt for basic groceries that had quietly climbed nearly 40% over 3 years, while my monthly check stayed exactly the same, understanding that something in my situation had to actually change rather than simply being worried about. I want to tell you what that number actually forced me to confront, and where it eventually led me, because the solution I found wasn't the retirement I'd originally planned for, but it turned out to be considerably better than the one I was slowly running out of money trying to protect. I spent 31 years teaching middle school history in a small town in Ohio, a career that paid modestly but steadily, the kind of work that let me raise 2 kids on a single income, and always believed, without really testing the belief, that it would eventually support a reasonably comfortable retirement. My wife, Carol, passed away 6 years before I retired, and I want to be honest that planning retirement alone, without her income or her steadier hand on our household budget, changed the math in ways I hadn't fully calculated until I was actually living inside it. I want to describe a specific number I'd carried in my head for years before retiring, a figure my financial advisor had once mentioned almost in passing, that I'd need roughly 60% of my working income to retire comfortably, a number that felt reassuring in my 50s and considerably less reassuring once I actually sat down and did the arithmetic at 66. My monthly income after retiring came to just under $1,900, combining a modest teacher's pension with Social Security, a figure that had looked adequate on paper years earlier but hadn't accounted for how much the actual cost of living would climb in the years between my planning and my retiring. I hadn't fully understood, before I actually retired, how much a fixed income quietly shrinks in real terms every single year it stays fixed, watching my grocery bills, my property taxes, and my healthcare premiums all rise steadily while my check arrived at the exact same number every month. I remember opening my property tax bill about 8 months into retirement with genuine dread, watching a number that had already felt tight become one I genuinely wasn't certain I could cover without dipping further into savings I'd promised myself I wouldn't touch for at least another decade. I remember one particular month, about a year into retirement, when my furnace failed in February, an $1,100 repair that arrived the same week as a dental bill I hadn't budgeted for, forcing me to transfer money out of savings I'd specifically told myself was untouchable. I remembered sitting at that kitchen table afterward, genuinely frightened in a way I hadn't expected retirement to make me feel, doing the math on how many more unplanned months like that one my savings could actually absorb before I'd be forced into decisions I didn't want to make. I remember calling my daughter that same week, not to ask for money, but simply because I needed to say the fear out loud to someone, and she was quiet for a long moment before telling me she'd noticed I'd stopped mentioning small trips or hobbies in our recent calls, something I hadn't even realized I'd been doing myself. I learned, doing more honest research that same month, that I wasn't an unusual case at all, that a significant share of retirees living primarily on Social Security and modest pensions were quietly making the exact same calculations I was, watching costs rise against income that simply couldn't rise with them. I understood, intellectually, that this was a structural problem, rather than any personal failure on my part, but understanding that broader pattern didn't fully soften the specific fear of watching my own independence become something I genuinely wasn't sure I could keep funding. I remember the specific phrase I kept returning to during that period, quietly running out, a phrase that captured something scarier than any single bill, the sense that decline wasn't going to arrive as one dramatic crisis, but as a slow, grinding erosion I might not notice clearly until it was too late to change course. I spent several months after that furnace repair simply cutting corners quietly, cancelling a magazine subscription, eating out less, turning the thermostat down further than was genuinely comfortable, telling myself these small adjustments would be enough without ever doing the fuller math that would have told me otherwise. I didn't tell my kids how tight things had actually become during that stretch, a distance I chose rather than one that happened to me, not wanting to worry them or admit that the retirement I'd planned for 30 years wasn't holding up the way I'd promised myself it would. I remember specifically declining an invitation to a former colleague's retirement dinner that spring, telling myself I simply wasn't in the mood, when the honest reason was that even a modest restaurant bill had started to feel like a decision I needed to think twice about. My daughter called about 2 months later, her voice carrying real concern, telling me directly that she'd done some research of her own after our earlier conversation, and that she wanted me to at least look at something before dismissing it outright. She told me she'd found information about American retirees relocating abroad specifically to stretch fixed incomes further, and I want to be honest that my first reaction was resistance, a feeling that leaving the only country I'd ever lived in would mean admitting some kind of failure. I remember her pushing back gently but firmly on that specific reaction, telling me that protecting my independence and my dignity wasn't failure, and that continuing to quietly erode my savings while telling no one wasn't actually protecting anything at all. I spent the following weeks actually researching more seriously, applying the same methodical habits I'd once used preparing lesson plans for 31 years, reading through cost of living comparisons, visa requirements, and healthcare access across several countries before the Philippines specifically stood out. I learned that a retiree income visa there was genuinely achievable on exactly the kind of fixed income I already had, and that everyday costs, housing, groceries, basic healthcare, ran low enough that my same $1,900 could plausibly cover a comfortable, rather than a constantly anxious life. I remember the specific spreadsheet I built that month, comparing my actual Ohio expenses line by line against realistic Philippine equivalents, watching a monthly budget that had felt perpetually tight in Ohio turn into one with actual breathing room once relocated, a piece of paper that did more to ease my fear than any reassurance anyone had offered me. I told my son and daughter together, over a video call, that I'd decided to move, watching my son's face carry visible worry before he'd even said a word, a reaction I understood completely given how far away I'd be from both of them. I explained the actual numbers to them plainly, the furnace repair, the quiet corner cutting, the spreadsheet comparison, wanting them to understand this wasn't an impulsive escape but a carefully reasoned decision built from real financial necessity rather than any restlessness or dissatisfaction with my life near them. I remember my daughter's response landing differently than I expected, telling me she felt relieved rather than worried once she understood the reasoning, admitting she'd spent months quietly afraid I was slipping toward real financial trouble without telling either of them, and that a clear plan felt considerably better than the silence I'd been keeping. I spent nearly 5 months preparing carefully after that conversation, verifying the visa process, researching specific coastal communities with established expat populations, and selling or donating most of my furniture before finally boarding a flight I'd once assumed I'd never seriously consider taking. I remember the specific anxiety of that first week, unfamiliar streets, an unfamiliar language, genuine second-guessing about whether I'd made a mistake I couldn't easily undo, feelings considerably more physical than any of the spreadsheet math had prepared me for. I remember the moment that anxiety actually started easing, about 10 days in, sitting at a small local cafe, doing rough math on an actual month of real expenses rather than projected ones, watching the number come in genuinely lower than my old Ohio budget, while my daily life felt fuller rather than more restricted. I want to share the specific numbers, because I think they matter more than any general reassurance. My rent for a comfortable one-bedroom near the coast, running roughly a third of what a comparable Ohio apartment would cost. Groceries and dining out combined, coming in at less than half my old grocery bill alone. I still put money into savings most months now, something that had become essentially impossible during my final year in Ohio, watching an account I'd once feared draining slowly actually grow again for the first time since I'd retired. I remember calling my daughter about 4 months in, specifically to tell her I'd gone an entire month without once doing the anxious late-night math I used to do constantly, a small detail that meant more to my actual quality of life than any single purchase or comfort the extra money now allowed. I hadn't anticipated, before moving, how much genuine community I'd find here, a nearby group of fellow American and European retirees who meet weekly, along with local neighbors who've been unfailingly patient with my slowly improving Tagalog and genuinely welcoming in ways I hadn't allowed myself to expect. I've taken up snorkeling for the first time in my 60s, something I never would have budgeted for in Ohio, discovering a version of retirement considerably more active and engaged than the quietly anxious one I'd been living before the move. I remember a specific evening about 6 months in, sharing dinner with 3 neighbors from 3 different countries, realizing partway through the conversation that I'd laughed more genuinely that single evening than I had across several preceding months back home, evidence that the financial relief had opened space for something beyond simple survival. My daughter and son visited together about 8 months after my move, their first real chance to see the actual life I'd built rather than simply hear about it over calls, and I made a point of walking them through my genuine monthly budget, not defensively, but simply as honest evidence. I remember my son's specific reaction, watching me interact comfortably with local friends and neighbors throughout their visit, admitting afterward that seeing me genuinely relaxed, rather than quietly worried, had eased a concern he hadn't fully voiced, even to his sister, before actually seeing it himself. I remember a particular afternoon during that visit, all 3 of us at the same small cafe, where my own anxiety had first started easing, my daughter doing her own rough math on a napkin, and admitting, almost surprised, that the numbers genuinely worked exactly as I'd described them months earlier. If you're currently doing the same anxious kitchen table math I once did, watching a fixed income slowly lose ground against rising costs, I want to tell you what this experience taught me. The number on your monthly statement isn't a verdict on your independence. It's simply a starting point for a different kind of planning. I'd encourage genuine, honest research into what your specific income could actually support somewhere else, rather than assuming the place you've always lived is the only place you're allowed to grow old comfortably. I still keep that old spreadsheet, the one comparing my Ohio expenses against my Philippine ones, saved on my laptop, not out of lingering anxiety, but as a genuine record of the specific moment fear turned into a plan I could actually act on. If you're facing your own version of that kitchen table math, I hope you find the same clarity I eventually reached, honest research into what your real numbers could support, and the willingness to consider that comfort and dignity in retirement might be waiting somewhere you haven't yet let yourself seriously consider. I'll see you in the next one. I want to describe the first January I spent here, because back in Ohio, winter had quietly become the month I dreaded most, heating bills alone eating nearly a fifth of my monthly check, forcing me to choose some months between a comfortable house and a fuller pantry. That January here, I remember sitting outside on a small balcony in the evening, genuinely surprised by how long it took me to notice I hadn't thought about a heating bill even once, an absence so complete it almost felt strange, like a worry I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was optional. I called my son that same week, just to tell him about it, admitting it sounded like a small thing to mention, watching him tell me it wasn't small at all, that he'd never once heard me talk about winter without at least a note of quiet dread, until that specific call. I remember writing the number down afterward almost out of habit, my old 30-year pattern of anxious budgeting refusing to fully disappear even once the actual anxiety had, watching a January total come in lower than nearly any single Ohio winter month I could remember from the preceding 6 years. I want to share a specific test of whether this decision could hold up under real pressure, not just comfortable months, when a close neighbor here, another American retiree, had a sudden hospital scare about a year into my time here. I remember driving him myself to the local hospital, genuinely frightened for him and quietly frightened for myself too, wondering privately whether healthcare here would actually hold up the way my research had promised, or whether I'd built my entire plan on cost comparisons that ignored something critical. I watched him receive genuinely attentive care over the following days, and I watched the actual bill afterward, a fraction of what the same emergency would have cost either of us back home, confirming something my spreadsheet had claimed months earlier that I hadn't fully trusted until I saw it proven under real circumstances. I remember calling my daughter that same week, telling her honestly about the scare, watching her go quiet before admitting this was exactly the kind of moment she'd worried about most when I first told her I was leaving, and that hearing it had actually gone well mattered more to her than any budget spreadsheet ever had. I want to describe something I never expected to find again after retiring. A genuine return to teaching, when a small local learning center here asked whether I'd be willing to tutor English a few mornings a week for local students preparing for university abroad. I remember my first morning walking into that small classroom, 31 years of habit returning almost immediately, and realizing partway through the lesson that I hadn't simply been missing income back in Ohio, I'd also been missing this specific, particular version of purpose without fully admitting it to myself. The modest stipend they offered wasn't why I said yes, though I want to be honest, it does add a small, comfortable cushion to my monthly budget now. Several $100s I hadn't planned for, quietly closing whatever narrow gap still occasionally existed between careful and genuinely comfortable. I remember telling my son about it, expecting him to focus on the extra income, and instead hearing him say I sounded, for the first time in years, exactly like the father he remembered before Carol passed, and before retirement had quietly worn me down, a comment that meant more than any number could. I think about that original evening often, sitting at my Ohio kitchen table with a Social Security statement in one hand and a grocery receipt in the other, genuinely afraid I was watching my independence slowly run out with no real plan to stop it. If I could speak to myself from that exact moment, I'd tell him the fear he was feeling wasn't wrong, but the conclusion he was quietly reaching, that this was simply the shape his remaining years had to take, was the actual mistake worth correcting. 3 years out now, teaching mornings I genuinely look forward to, savings actually growing again, my children visiting twice yearly and calling more often than they ever did before. I think that frightened man at the kitchen table would be relieved to know the number on his statement wasn't a verdict after all. If you're sitting at your own version of that table right now, I hope you let the fear push you toward genuine research rather than quiet resignation, the same way mine eventually did. I'll see you in the next one. I want to describe a former colleague back in Ohio, Walter, who I'd stayed close with since our teaching days, and who called me about a year into my move, describing almost the exact same kitchen table math I'd once done myself, the same fixed check losing ground against the same rising costs. I remember him telling me he'd looked into moving too, then talked himself out of it within a week, admitting he was afraid of exactly what I'd once been afraid of, leaving behind the only country and community he'd ever known at nearly 70 years old. I didn't push him, only offered to walk him through my actual spreadsheet the way my daughter once walked through it with me, showing him real numbers rather than reassurance, and I remember a long silence on the call before he finally said he'd think about it seriously, rather than dismiss it again. I remember the call I got from him 8 months later, standing at his own new apartment 2 towns over from mine, admitting the hardest part hadn't been the decision itself, but the several months he'd spent quietly afraid, before finally trusting the math the way I once had to. I want to share something that surprised me. A conversation with a woman here in her late 50s, recently retired early after a layoff, who told me she'd assumed a move like this was really only sensible for people already deep into their 70s, with nothing left to build. I told her honestly that the earlier I'd made this decision, the more good years I'd have had to actually build something here rather than simply arrive to preserve what little time felt left, and I watched something shift in how she was thinking about her own timeline. She mentioned my tutoring work specifically, asking whether opportunities like that existed for someone her age too, and I remember genuine pleasure in telling her yes. That purpose here wasn't reserved for any particular age, only for anyone willing to actually look for it. I think about that conversation often now, understanding that the fear I'd once carried at my kitchen table wasn't really about age at all. It was about believing decline was inevitable once a fixed number stopped keeping pace, a belief neither she nor I had needed to accept as permanently true. I want to describe a small dinner I hosted here on the 3rd anniversary of my move, inviting Walter, my tutoring students' families, and several neighbors who'd become genuine close friends, a gathering that would have been financially unthinkable for me during my final anxious Ohio year. I remember looking around that table partway through the evening, genuinely struck by how full a life had grown, from a decision that had once felt, at its very beginning, like nothing more than a frightened retreat from a number I couldn't make work. My daughter called partway through that same evening, and I remember stepping outside briefly just to describe the table to her, hearing real joy in her voice, as she said it sounded less like a retirement plan at this point, and more like an actual second chapter of my life. I told her honestly that was exactly how it had come to feel, that the fear at my old kitchen table had never actually been the end of anything, only the uncomfortable, necessary beginning of a decision I was now genuinely grateful I'd made. I keep a small photo now on my apartment wall, taken that same anniversary evening, the full table, the familiar faces, a picture I sometimes catch myself looking at when I want a reminder of exactly how far a frightened number on a kitchen table can eventually lead. 4 years out now from that original evening, I still do the math most months, an old habit 30 years of careful budgeting never fully lets go of, but the number I'm tracking now is a savings account, growing, rather than one I'm quietly watching disappear. I think about Walter's hesitation, and the younger woman's assumption that this kind of change was only for the very old, and I understand both fears completely, because I once carried a version of each of them myself before I finally let the math lead me somewhere better. If you're still sitting with your own version of that fear, unsure whether a number on a page has to mean permanent decline, I hope you let it lead you toward honest research, the way mine eventually did, rather than toward quiet resignation. I'll see you in the next one.